Hello, everyone, and welcome everybody to the ECogS Seminars series. Today, we are happy to welcome Shigeru Taguchi. Shigeru Taguchi is a professor of philosophy and the director of the Center for Human Nature, Artificial Intelligence, and Neuroscience, also known as CHAIN, in the Hokkaido University here in Japan. He has been working in the field of phenomenology, philosophy of consciousness, and Japanese philosophy for over 20 years, and has published several books. For the past 10 years, he has been engaged in interdisciplinary research with neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, mathematicians, and AI researchers. And today he'll be talking about consciousness and how perhaps we need to reconceptualize some assumed notions of consciousness. Professor Taguchi, thank you very much for joining us today, and the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for your introduction. And I also thank you, Tom and other organizers for inviting me to this wonderful event. And today, so first I will share the screen with you. I think this, maybe this one. Okay. Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. So today I'm going to talk about a twisted loop between inside and outside. This is my proposal for having an image about consciousness. So I would like to search for an appropriate image of consciousness, a more appropriate image of consciousness. And I will use phenomenology, ideas from phenomenology and enactivism. Yeah, and so I heard that some of you, so there are people in audience who are not familiar with phenomenology and enactivism. So I would like to, I will make my discussion very clear, and so that everyone can understand without prior knowledge. So let me start. So this is the outline of my talk. So first I will I will show the mediated nature of consciousness, and then I will reject illusory substantialization of consciousness, and then I will show a new image of consciousness as a twisted loop. So first, introduction. Consciousness, it is one of the central topics in modern and contemporary philosophy, and it is also very often discussed in various disciplines. So there are interdisciplinary debates on consciousness since the late 20th century or so. And many disciplines are involved, such as neuroscience, psychology, cognitive science, artificial intelligence, and so on. So the current situation is, however, very chaotic, I think. So there are a lot of theories of consciousness, such as IIT, so integrated information theory, or global workspace theory, or higher order theory, and so on. But there is no ultimate consensus in this field. So there is even united definition of consciousness. So the situation is quite chaotic, and it would be difficult to advance a theory of consciousness without considering what it means to think about consciousness. Not only consciousness itself is a hard problem, but how to think about consciousness, it is already a problem, I think. So this approach is maybe similar to the meta problem of consciousness that David Chalmers proposes. This meta problem is roughly in something like that. I mean, the problem of consciousness is very hard. It is known as hard problem. So it is difficult to address this problem directly. Therefore, maybe we can think about the way how this problem is dealt with, how this problem is addressed. So this this approach to consciousness can be addressed empirically. Therefore, it is more easy to approach. This is roughly the idea of meta problem of consciousness that David Chalmers proposes. And maybe my approach is a little bit similar to that. So when we hear the word consciousness, we feel as if we understand it. So everyone understands the word consciousness. But when we are asked to define or explain consciousness, we are at a loss. It is really difficult to define what is consciousness. So if there is no common understanding of what phenomenon is being referred to by this word consciousness, so the discussion will only become confused and no useful progress can be made. So in order to overcome this situation, we need to look at the way we think when we understand the concept of consciousness. So the way of thinking about consciousness, it would be very important, I think. Generally speaking, in philosophy, after Kant and Hegel, it is said that as consideration is naive if it does not include a reflection on the way of thinking. So if it does not include the self-reflection of thinking itself. So in order to know something deeply, it is essential to engage in the activity of thinking about thinking. So instead of thinking while ignoring the nature of thinking itself. So if we don't do this and think directly or straightforwardly about the object of our thought, we tend to remain trapped in the constraints of our own thinking and keep circling in the same orbit, like a fly in a bottle, circling around in the bottle without finding the way out. So this also applies to the problem of consciousness. So if we simply and straightforwardly think about the vaguely understood phenomenon of consciousness, we tend to get tangled up in the specific constraints of this concept and keep running in circles around the same aporias. It would be our situation. And therefore, we need to reflect on what is going on in our thinking when we are talking about consciousness. Oh, sorry. Maybe I. Okay. So in the following, I will focus on the way or ways.
Screen, we lost it.
Okay. Sorry. Screen was maybe this one.
Yes, now we see it. Thank you.
Okay. So in the following, I will focus on the way or ways we think about consciousness. Okay. So then I move on to the next section. Consciousness is mediated by its negation. First, I will start with John Searle's definition of consciousness. So in his book, Mind, Language, and Society, John Searle made a tentative definition of consciousness. so which has been accepted by a relatively large number of researchers. I often observed some researchers used this definition. And the definition is as follows. By consciousness, I mean those states of sentience or awareness that typically begin when we wake up in the morning from a dreamless sleep and continue throughout the day until we fall asleep again. So other ways in which consciousness can cease is if we die, go into a coma, or otherwise become unconscious. So this is the tentative definition of consciousness by Searle. In this definition, sentience or awareness, these words are rough synonyms for consciousness, I think. So therefore, they contain almost no new information. So the core of this definition is the contrast between conscious and non-conscious states. Contrast between consciousness and non-consciousness. So I would like to claim that stress is only consciousness is only explicitly noticed when it is contrasted with its absence. So consciousness is always there. So when we are thinking, we are always conscious. And that's why we only notice that existence of, we only notice the existence of consciousness through the loss of it. So maybe we can use the analogy of air. So air is always there, but when it is gone or thinner, you first realize it was there. So in the water, there is no air. So we can notice that there is no air, so the absence of air. And contrasted to this absence of air, we can notice the existence of air that we are not aware of in normal situation. So the consciousness, is something like that, like air. In this way, the explicitly thematized concept of consciousness is not a simple concept that straightforwardly names something that is there, but a higher order concept that is already mediated by negation. Consciousness can only be made explicit when you notice that it is not absent. It's non-absence. So this negation of the loss of consciousness, so negation of negation, that forms the explicit concept of consciousness. I would like to claim this. So like the figure here, so consciousness can become aware of itself only through its negation. So consciousness can only be specified or made conscious as a positive event in opposition to the very impressive event of losing consciousness. So losing consciousness would be a very impressive event, such as sleep, fainting, anesthesia, death. And it is also very impressive if the consciousness come back. So the return from a non-conscious state to consciousness, or the rebirth of consciousness. It seems to be a remarkable and extraordinary event. It's something very interesting event. And maybe, so motivated by such an experience, we may have created the concept of consciousness. This is my conjecture. And there's another negation of consciousness. So this is consciousness of others. So consciousness that others have cannot be given to me, at least directly. So it seems obvious that others have consciousness. It is an obvious fact, but it is not given in the same way as my own consciousness. So the others' consciousness of others are not directly given to me. So mediated by this negation of the direct experience or direct givenness of others' experience. So I can positively recognize the fact that my own consciousness is given to me. So the gist of the first section is as follows. Consciousness is mediated by a twofold negation. So one is the experience of losing consciousness, and the other is the experience of the fact that others' consciousnesses are not given to me. So the positive recognition that there is consciousness actually means a double negation. So negation of negation. So without such intervening negations, the givenness of consciousness is too obvious to be noticed in a positive or explicit way. So it is only by contrast with such negations that we can grasp and conceptualize consciousness positively and explicitly. So let's move on to the next section, illusory substantialization of consciousness. So as shown in the previous section, the phenomenon of consciousness stands out via its negations. So however, when we start calling it by a single noun, consciousness, so what immediately happens is that we substantialize or reify it. It is a very common tendency, I think, to substantialize something. So when we call something by a noun, we tend to think that there is a thing that corresponds to that noun. So this also applies to the word consciousness. Maybe an analogy of a whole might be useful. So a whole is an empty space. So if you remove the object around the whole, is the whole still there? Like that? So a whole is identified depending on the contrast with its surroundings. So that's why there is no independent substance called whole. So if there is no object, then whole disappears. So in this way, a whole is dependent on the object surrounding it, but nevertheless, we can say that there is a whole, even if there's no substance here. So consciousness can be conceptualized only by contrasting it with non-consciousness, like a whole. So, however, there's a tendency that this mediated nature of consciousness is forgotten and that consciousness is regarded as an independent substance. So we should not forget that the simple word consciousness implies the mutual mediation of various phenomena, including the negations of consciousness. So consciousness is mediated by its negations, as I said. So the situation is like a whole. So without mediation of other phenomena, mediation by other phenomena, there is nothing left in this way. Yeah, but in fact, there is a mutual mediations of various phenomena, and that forms what is called consciousness as a phenomenon. So it is unlikely that we can have an intuition of consciousness as a simple monolithic phenomenon. maybe we have an illusion that we have an intuition of consciousness as a simple phenomenon, but yeah, it is just an illusion, I would claim. And thinking of consciousness as if it were a single thing leads to, I think, unfounded talk and sterile controversy about whether it exists or does not exist, like controversy between realism, eliminativism, and illusionism of consciousness. So what kind of observable or concrete phenomena mediate what we call consciousness? Such question would be important, I think. Or when we say that there is consciousness, what specific phenomena are combined and how are they combined? So such a kind of analysis. So if we analyze in this direction, so there is less danger that the debate will lose its foothold and get nowhere. Such an approach is called maybe again I did something.
And we lost your screen again.
Screen, yeah. Okay, sorry. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So such a kind of approach. So I call this a mediation-based approach. And this idea is written in my paper, Mediation-Based Phenomenology. So it is downloadable from the internet. So if you are interested, please check it. So this idea is inspired by Hajime Tanabe, who is a leading philosopher in the Kyoto school in Japan. And Tanabe was influenced by Hegel, and so my idea is also influenced by Hegel indirectly or directly. And it is also a little bit similar to contrastivism that Walter Sinnott Armstrong and other people propose. But I don't enter this idea here. Okay. Then, yeah, I'd like to move on to the next section, consciousness as a twisted loop. I would propose a new image of consciousness. So what is particularly powerful in substantializations of consciousness is to conceive of it as something enclosed within the interior. So something closed in the skull. So we think of consciousness as if it were a thing that occupies a place in space. So can we say that consciousness occupies a place in the skull, for example? Yeah. Now, yeah, I'd like to mention phenomenological concepts like intentionality. So when we refer to consciousness, we are basically assuming the consciousness of something. So this consciousness means consciousness of something. This is the idea in the early Husserlian phenomenology. The consciousness is in principle relational in nature. And this relational nature of consciousness is called intentionality of consciousness. And when it comes to consciousness, we rarely ask where it is. So in everyday life, in daily life, it is, yeah, we almost never ask the question, where is your consciousness? It's very weird question. maybe the common question would be, what are you conscious of? So or what's the object? What is the object of your consciousness? So it is okay, but where is your consciousness? It's very weird question, I think. So, however, some might argue that the object of consciousness inside consciousness, and that consciousness is still closed. So the object of consciousness is still in the consciousness. And then, if you think like that, this raises a further question. So if so, does the true object lie outside of consciousness? So outside of all that consciousness can know. So the true object is beyond the consciousness. So it is outside of my consciousness. Then I can never know anything about the true consciousness, a true object. So then we fall into agnosticism. We know nothing about the true object. Or should we say that there is no such thing as a true object? So all we can know about object is what we can be conscious of. So the object is always in consciousness. There's nothing beyond that. If we think like that, then this position would be called idealism. And agnosticism and idealism, they are not very popular in contemporary philosophy, I think. Maybe it is a bad idea to separate the object of consciousness from the true object, and in such a way to duplicate the object. It would be a bad idea, I think. This specious riddle or pseudo problem arises from the fact that we imagine consciousness as a spatial thing, like a box or a bag. So this criticism is found in early Husserl, so in such works like logical investigations or the idea of phenomenology. Maybe it's better not to imagine consciousness as a spatial domain. And the relational nature should be taken seriously, and what we call consciousness is maybe nothing other than a relation. Such a relational understanding would be important, I would claim. So let me think, why do we think of consciousness as a closed inner world? I think there are two reasons, at least. So first, we cannot experience the consciousness of others. And second, when our brain stops functioning, our consciousness also disappears. These facts induce the inference or conjecture that consciousness is in the head. So note that this is an inference or conjecture, so we can never directly observe that our consciousness is in our head. It is not observable. It is just a conjecture, I would claim. So let's think about this point more carefully. So I said, first, we cannot experience the consciousness of others, or we cannot experience the consciousness of each other. And second, when the brain stops functioning, consciousness also disappears. So from these facts, maybe we can make a conjecture. Consciousness is hidden inside the skull or hidden inside brain. So however, the minimum we can conclude from these facts is that consciousness has a strong relationship with the body. So this is the minimum. And everything beyond that would be conjecture, I think. So the body, including the brain, is a necessary condition for consciousness, and without the body, consciousness cannot exist. And in this context, I would like to talk about the double mediation for consciousness. So first, consciousness is mediated by the body, so it cannot be without the body. And second, consciousness is mediated by the object. As I said, consciousness is always relational, so it is mediated by the object. So it is nothing other than the relation to objects. But the object is always given in the world. Object appears always against the background of the world. So therefore, the second point can be modified in this way. So consciousness is mediated by the world. It depends on the relation to the world. In this way, so consciousness ultimately means the relational event that depends on or is mediated by the body and the world. Yeah. Consciousness depends on the body on the one hand and the world on the other. So it could be also said that consciousness is nothing other than a relationship of mutual mediation between the body and the world. So this view of consciousness is in line with what Francisco Varela and other people call fundamental circularity of self and world. So this fundamental circularity consists of the body and world. The body makes actions in the world, and in this way, the body creates the world in a way, in a sense, and it also the perception of the world creates the image of the world or experience of the world and so on. So in this way, there is a circle. This circularity is maybe a key to understand consciousness. So on the one hand, the body is a part of the world and is contained within the world. On the other hand, we can know about the world outside the body. So the body is a small part of the world, but this small part can understand and experience the world outside the body. So it can go beyond itself to know about the world outside the body. So in this way, knowing encompasses the world in a sense. The world is created or enacted by bodily action. So if we don't have our body, or if the body disappears, we don't have the world as it is. If we are not bodily there, then the world around us disappears, in a sense. So this is called enactivism, or the inactive approach. And in this sense, the world is enveloped in the body. So it is there only insofar as it appears to the body. So here is the relationship in which the body and the world are nested within each other. Here's a mutually nested structure. So the world encompasses the body, and the body encompasses the world. So this mutually nested structure is there. So this is a kind of loop, but cannot be observed as a straightforward flat circle, but rather it is a loop formed by a mutual inclusion, mutually nested structure. So there is a twist where the inside becomes the outside and the outside becomes the inside. In this way, this is twisted. And this is not a dualism of mind and matter, I would claim. So, but a monism of nature. There is only one nature, only one reality. And in this reality, the body is only a small part of the material world. So in this way, the body is material in a sense. But at the same time, so when a structure with a certain complexity, so for example, brain, is created in a part of the world, this local structure or the body will realize the function of reflecting or mirroring the whole world inside it. So a small part of the world, which is called body and or the brain, with a certain complexity, it mirrors the whole world inside it. And so Douglas Hofstadter calls this kind of loop a strange loop. So such a strange loop is established in the physical world. So there is nothing special, nothing mysterious here. It is just a part of physical world, but yeah, the structure is very special. And especially this loop structure is very special. This yeah, is what Hofstadter claimed in his book, I Am a Strange Loop, 2007. And this kind of strange loop gives the body its special meaning as a self and establishes a consciousness. Consciousness arises from this kind of special structure as a loop. And Kitaro Nishida said something similar. So he called this a self-mapping structure. Okay, and in this way, consciousness can be redefined as something that is deeply connected to the body, but also related to the entirety of the world beyond the body. It is not appropriate to think of the phenomenon called consciousness as a closed inner world inside the head or inside the skull. So rather, it is better to be imagined as a twisted loop or twisted loop structure spanning the poles of the individual or local body on the one hand, and the universal world or the universe on the other. So the body encompasses the world, and the world encompasses the body. So in this mutually nested loop, maybe consciousness arises. So the conclusion. It is inappropriate to regard consciousness as a closed inner world, closed inner space, or something like that, or to think of it as omnipresent throughout the universe as panpsychists do. I didn't mention panpsychism a lot, but yeah, what I claimed is a small part of the world, a special structure, a special loop structure in the world is fundamental for consciousness. That's why it is not omnipresent in the world or in the universe. So therefore, I think my idea would be different from a panpsychism. So these would be inappropriate ideas, I think. And rather, we should imagine consciousness as something like twisted loop in which the individual body and the universal world mutually encompass each other. That would be my proposal. maybe there are some outcomes from this image. So first, clearly unraveling this loop involves exploring how consciousness depends on the individual body, especially on the brain. So the studies of brain, so neuroscience, can be integrated with phenomenology using this image of consciousness, because they are, the brain and consciousness are fundamentally related to each other. And second, also the proposed image of consciousness allows us to naturally incorporate the sensory-motor loop into theories of consciousness, because sensory-motor loop is always a part of the twisted loop I proposed. And in this way, we can achieve an integration of theories of embodied cognition with consciousness studies. So consciousness studies can be embodied in this way. So this is the last slide. So the proposed redefinition of consciousness may promote a scientific study of consciousness. And first, at least we will no longer be bothered by irreconcilable philosophical antagonisms between idealism and realism, or panpsychism and physicalist reductionism, or eliminativism. And second, it provides a comprehensive perspective that integrates scientific study of consciousness, which has been conducted mainly in neuroscience, with enactivism, the inactive approach developed by Varela, Thompson, Di Paolo, and other people, and also sensory-motor contingency theory advocated by O'Regan and Noe. And third, this may also provide a clue to the possibility of artificial consciousness. So in order to develop artificial consciousness, the image of consciousness as a twisted loop might be useful. I don't know how, but maybe it might be useful. Because without a clear definition of consciousness, it would be very difficult to develop something like artificial consciousness. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.